edited the volume titled Social Reproduction Theory, Remapping Class, Recentering Oppression, which I have to say is a book that I love and has been really important in shaping my own thinking. She writes extensively on Marxist theory, gender, and the politics of Islamophobia. Her writing has appeared in many outlets, including the Journal of Asian Studies, South Asia Research, Electronic Intifada, International Socialist Review, Jacobin, Salon, HuffPost, and the New Left Review. Tithi's not only a professor and author, she's also a longtime activist for Palestinian justice. Many of us here may know Tithi as a leading voice in the International Women's Strike, a movement that calls on women to not only abstain from paid work, but to withhold their reproductive labor, to go a day without cooking meals, washing dishes, and coordinating children's schedules. You may also have read Tithi's recent writing in Dissent, The Guardian, and elsewhere, bringing a sharp feminist analysis to the wave of teacher strikes that has swept across the country. And last but certainly not least, Tithi is co-author of the landmark new text, Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto, which we have a panel focusing on this afternoon. So her talk today is titled Striking as Worker, Striking as Women, the Feminist Strike in an Era of Social Movements. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Tithi Bhattacharya.
Just saying before I started that it's really good to, I think we should have more of these meetings where ordinary people eat while we talk, have meetings, children come flitting in and out because that's what real life is. So please don't apologize for eating or chomping. This is really, really good. And it's a fantastic part of social reproduction that we are talking and eating at the same time and thinking about collective struggle. First of all, thank you very much to Philly Socialist Feminist Working Group of the DSA for having me here, for uniting me with old friends, for actually giving me the opportunity of meeting new ones. I am very, very looking forward to learning from the kind of work that you've been doing in Philly and as well as in this area. I apologize for the fact that I was not here. I do not apologize for the fact that this country does not have a rail system and we are dependent on the bloody planes to get us everywhere. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about how the two phrases are viewed in our movement. The one phrase is class struggle and the other phrase is feminist struggle. Both of these phrases, first of all, you should see that they are two separate phases. So they're either joined by and, class struggle and feminist struggle, or the worst case scenario is class struggle versus feminist struggle, okay? So those are the most to watch out for. So, but the fact remains that in our thinking as well as in our social movements, we have two separate phrases of class struggle and feminist struggle. And I think that I am going to talk about that. I'm going to start with an anecdote, as all of us are aware of some of these things play out. So last night, while we were stuck in Detroit Airport, 6 hours, I am on the plane. We were not allowed to deplane for the longest time. So I was on the plane, stuck. The person next to me is a young teacher in Philadelphia, and she is the band leader of her school band. Okay, so she plays the clarinet, but she's a band leader in her band. I said, what are you doing here? She said, well, I went with all the other band leaders from the area, from public schools, to Indiana to see the factory where musical instruments were being made. He says it makes a tremendous difference. It made a tremendous difference to me to actually see the people who made my clarinet or who made my students' viola. So they went to an instrument making factory to talk to them. So, we got talking about the necessity of labor. I talked to her about her job as a school teacher, and she said, what we're doing right now is simply defending our music programs. We can't even enjoy music anymore because all we're doing is defending, okay? And so we talked some more, and she said, what do you do? I said, well, then feminism came up. She said, I'm not really a feminist. I said, do you think that your school programs need defending? She said, yes. I said, do you think wages should be higher? She said, yes. But she did not see herself as a feminist. So this is not just a perception we have in our head. It also makes sense for political orientation. So here was someone who was actually ready to fight to defend her school, to defend the working class, but she did not see herself as a feminist. So this is something that we need to address, comrades, really seriously, as to how do we understand this gap between feminist struggle and class struggle. So this is what I am going to focus on today. So organizations also carry this logic forward. And I want to talk about what organizations that call itself Marxist or are influenced by Marxist thought also have this sort of ambient feeling about it that class struggle is the most important struggle of all times. And there is no denying that it is. But what does class struggle actually look like? That's what we want to say. So let me start with the theory. There is, as we all know, why is this important that these two phrases not be separate? So there is a tremendous underdeveloped insight in Marxist theory, okay? And I'm going to try to break that down. And this underdeveloped insight is that Marx identifies labor power or our capacity to labor as that special thing, that special commodity. He uses various words, special commodity, unique commodity. So Marx identifies our capacity to labor as that unique commodity that capitalism needs, right? So without the working class, there is no capitalism. We're the ones who run the buses, run the schools, turn the lights on, okay? So without workers' labor, there is no capitalism. The appropriation of our surplus labor by capitalists is the source of their dominance. But Marx is frustratingly silent on the rest of the story. If labor power produces value, how is labor power itself produced? Surely workers do not spring from the ground to arrive at the marketplace fresh and ready to sell their labor power to the capitalists. So labor power has to be produced and reproduced. And this production and reproduction happens in a bunch of ways. One is obviously that we know very well is a kin-based site called the family, okay? So that's where labor power is produced and reproduced, but there are others. So many of these activities, which form the very basis of capitalism in that they reproduce the worker, are often done completely free of charge for the system by women and men within the household and the community. In the United States, women still carry a disproportionate share of this domestic labor. According to a recent survey, U.S. women put in 25.9 hours a week of unpaid domestic labor, while men put in 16.8, a difference of more than 9 hours. 9 hours is a lot of hours, comrades. That survey, however, only includes indexable tasks such as childcare, cooking, shopping, housework, gardening, and others. But of course, these tasks can be indexed, but to those tasks we have to add the additional non-indexable tasks such as providing psychic care and support to both employed and unemployed workers. Anyone who has had to soothe a child after a hard day at her own workplace, or figure out care for an aging parent, or had to speak to a friend on the phone because they had had a rubbish day, knows how important these apparently non-indexable, non-material tasks can be. And they're part of the entirety of work that goes in to bring us next day to our place of work, right? But labor power is only partially reproduced in the family. Education systems, public transport, recreation facilities such as parks and swimming pools, whether a working class community has access to clean water, let's think Flint, Michigan, let's think Standing Rock, are all resources nested within social relations that reproduce somebody's labor power or capacity to labor. Hence, access to all these resources that contribute to the reproduction of labor power is fundamental to both the individual worker and our class as a whole. Okay? So, relatedly, the working class is not only reproduced through biological reproduction, but slavery and immigration are two of the most horrendous ways in which labor forces of particular communities have been reproduced by capitalism. So if we look at all these resources and the fight for all these resources, is that class struggle? Is that not feminist struggle? Is feminist struggle then not class struggle? Is anti-racist struggle then not class struggle? Because it is our fight for these resources, often with women at the center of them, that is the basis of class struggle, a defense of our class. So that's what we are going to talk about in more detail, that the dangers of class being race and gender neutral, the assumption of class, okay? And relatedly, the assumption that gender is class-free, okay? So what are the dangers of severing class from gender and race? So first of all, let's look at many, especially the mainstream media, take delight in the storming of corporate boardrooms by a handful of women. Okay? These boardrooms and their adjoining golf courses have been the bastions of upper-class male privilege for centuries. We all know that. But it brings us to a central question. What do gender rights look like if we sever them from the question of the rights of the vast majority of us? Will the female CEO act in the interest of all women? The best policies to further the interests of all women, of feminism for the 99%, are also the very same policies that cut into the profits of capitalism as a system of production. For instance, free universal health care. It would ensure that every man, woman, and child, whether they're in paid employment or not, have free medical care on demand. This would reduce an unemployed woman's dependence on her employed partner and could potentially allow her control over her reproductive health and choices, not to mention support for her family's health and care. She could choose when and whether to have children and get home help free of cost for aging family members, thus drastically reducing her own labor in the home. But the medical industry is a multi-billion-dollar business that would fight this tooth and nail. So again, it is not separated from the overall question of capitalist power. Similarly, it is in the interest of women that we have a decent wage for all workers, since women are disproportionately amongst the lowest paid in the economy, and women of color are even lower on that scale of race and gender. But there too, we run into capitalism's profits, and it will be a hard battle to win. The Sheryl Sandbergs of the world are clear class warriors, using the language of women's rights to bolster a system that only benefits their class. The millionaire Sandberg even refused to pay her own interns until a public outcry made her change her decision. When Sandberg says that women need to work harder to achieve rewards, She's asking for a certain class of women, hers, to wrest more control away from the men of her class, while keeping the system intact that functions via the paid and unpaid labor of the vast majority of women. An understanding of capitalism as an integrated system where production is scaffolded by social reproduction can help us as fighters understand the significance of political struggle in both spheres and the necessity of uniting them. Let us take the case of reproductive rights, one of the critical fights of our times, which is not, by the way, directly a workplace struggle. Are reproductive rights simply about a woman's ability to have access to abortion and contraception? In reality, reproductive rights ought to be called reproductive justice. A woman's right to choose is not just about the right to have, not to have babies, but the right also to have them. The history of African American women and other women of color in America is bloodied by instances of forced sterilization by the state. Throughout the 1960s, the states of Illinois, Iowa, Ohio, Virginia, and Tennessee considered compulsory sterilization laws for black mothers on welfare. When the contraception drug Norplant was first released in the market, an editorial in the Philadelphia Inquirer suggested that it was a solution to black poverty. A similar fate awaited women in Puerto Rico when U.S. industry, under the economic program called Operation Bootstrap, went to the island in search of cheap labor in the 1930s and 1940s. Many factories ran on-site birth control clinics for women workers, and some refused to hire women unless they had been sterilized. Moreover, reproductive choice cannot just be about control over our ovaries. It is about control over our lives, about whether and when to have children, how many children to have time to take care of them, to have public schools to send them to have them and their fathers not be behind bars, and most importantly, to have a decent wage to be able to make decisions about all of those things. The New York Times recently reported that there was a 9% decline in the fertility rate from 2007 to 2011, a drop that demographers believe began after the recession took hold. In other words, the Times has just figured out that most ordinary women prefer to have babies when they feel that they have the economic means to feed and raise them. So the question of reproduction then is a feminist issue, but it is an issue tied to the most fundamental questions of our society. Who labors, for whom, and for how long? Again, revealing to us the absurdity of calling two kinds of struggle, class struggle and feminist struggle. This is why in organizations where we fight for wages, or organizations that only claim that they fight for wages, for example, labor unions, we need to raise the question of reproductive justice, of racial justice, of justice for Palestine. And in our organizations where we fight against sexism and racism, we need to raise the question of wages. We need a generation of unruly women and men to make that connection in our workplaces, on our campuses, and on our street. That is the real tradition of revolutionary feminism, or of feminism for the 99%. But if class struggles are anti-racist struggles and feminist struggles, what kind of strategies are relevant for our times? We are currently in the midst, all of you in this room know this, of an international strike wave by teachers. From Tunisia to Tamil Nadu, from Brazil to Mexico, and most notably all over the United States, there is a combative strike movement developing with teachers at the head of it. It is, however, not a coincidence that this sector of work, with its female majority workforce, has emerged as one of the most militant strike sites for the global struggle against austerity. For 40 years, neoliberalism has systematically corroded institutions that our class needs for our life making. Food and fuel subsidies have been removed, public food distribution systems have been dismantled, hospitals and schools privatized, even public parks have been starved of funds, and municipal councils forced to consider selling these green spaces. What emerged in the wake of such predation were communities and children abandoned by the state, haunted by darkening futures in neighborhoods of boarded up houses and flourishing pawn shops. In such communities, the act and practice of care was and remains a political act. As austerity robbed us of the infrastructures necessary for the reproduction of a life of dignity, the restoration of care emerged as one of the key battles against capitalism. As I said before, and as we know, care work in the home is still mostly performed by women. Similarly, professions that encapsulate the spirit of care work, teaching, nursing, home care, often have a disproportionately large number of female staff. What is of significance here, however, is not just women perform care work, but the political meaning and dimensions of what I am referring to as the care rubric. Care, I think we need to understand, should not be in our times seen in its individual manifestations alone, where someone, which is often a woman, provides care for an ailing body, a needy child, or a hungry family. In calling care a political act under neoliberalism, I'm referring to all acts and professions whose project it is to reduce the injuries of class. Thus, public schools that aim to better the life chances of working class children, public parks which can be restorative for their families, hospitals where working class lives can be repaired and rebuilt, are all instances of care in this political sense. All these services and infrastructures are those that are vital for the production of people, not just for reproducing their lives, but also for building capacities and attributes that are essential to the human condition. Locating care as one of the most political responses to austerity helps us understand better the connecting tissue between the various women-led movements of recent years. From the Argentinian mass strikes against gender violence, the immense movement against water privatization in Ireland, to the current wave of teacher strikes, we can finally see them as driven by the same force, the need to establish a new common good. It is this new wave of struggle that has actually finally managed to blur this dangerous border between class struggle and feminist struggle. Consider the points of political convergence between the worldwide walkouts of Google employees against sexual harassment and the international women's strike movement that began on March 8, 2017 and shows no signs of abating. While the Google walkouts were cited in workplaces, the March 8 movement has been on the streets. But both movements are predicated upon an explicitly feminist agenda. Most importantly, these braided strands of struggle have altered the boundaries of what counts as a feminist issue. This new class struggle feminism has moved the compass from effects to causes of gender discrimination. Thus, the new movement against gender violence as it is against immigration laws that enforce precarity on migrant women and expose them to preying managers and bosses. Similarly, this new generation of feminists refuse to accept equal pay with men when both wages are low. Rather, the movement has enlarged the purview of feminism to address universal issues of wages, healthcare, and police violence. Hence, while many of these protests are about better pay or cost reduction for particular services, they must not be seen in their outward form, but in their inner essence, as movements against neoliberal rapacity and for restoring care to working class lives. It is very clear as we look around the world, and if we want to write our history, which are not under scorched skies, we need to recognize that austerity and life are in a deadly opposition. The social capacities with which we make life and the institutions with which we maintain life and satisfy our needs are increasingly under threat. From conditions of birth, such as reproductive rights, access to healthcare, to simple provisions that can ensure dignity in old age, pensions, social security, the life cycle of the majority is now punctuated by a ghoulish metronome of food shortage, poisoned water, and schools closures. In decimating social provisioning, capitalism undermines our collective life-making, but the harm is no longer limited to the social. Capitalism's relentless productivist drive has now triggered climate change, threatening all life as we know it. How then do we take our lives back? Well, I want to suggest 3 ways that we learn from the current movements in how to reconstitute our struggles. One is to redefine what wealth is. Capitalism has always promised a higher living standard than any economic system before, and this is understood as a plenitude of things. We need a redefinition of wealth and the invention of new means of creating that wealth. Jobs, we are told, are our only means of creating wealth or assuring economic growth. The regime of work under capitalism is such that the wage appears as an end in itself rather than the means to a life of dignity. If we recognize the wage for what it is, a forced historical intervention between the laboring human and her life, then we can think about new ways to irrigate that life. This means we can demand that the labor of society be reorganized around jobs that enrich life rather than be harnessed in the irrational production of endless commodities. Paying close attention to the dark histories of racial and gender inequalities, for instance, in the United States, means that we cannot simply create green jobs, but we must seek to link any jobs program to multiple forms of social sustainability in ways that jobs can become tools to counteract systemic injustice rather than reproduce them. So green jobs must be attentive to racial and gender questions. Schools and hospitals, public housing and transport, all such projects that sustain and improve the social reproduction of life are not simply our means to an ecologically viable future. They are spaces which allow us to imagine an alternative vision of wealth and experiment in ways in which human labor can be employed for the production of solidarities, for mutual pleasures, and for beauty. We must reorganize social reproduction, this much is clear, but how exactly? Here, global movements demanding social provisioning, often led by women, should be seen as tentative blueprints in 3 crucial ways. First, because they give us a sense of what kind of social goods we need to reclaim for the many. Second, because the scale and militancy of the protests provide roadmaps for how to get these goods, and finally, because they model a politics of what can be called insurgent caring, whereby these movements demand that care be provided at multiple scales of life, individual, community, and planetary. Globally, there has been an explosion of movements demanding care understood in this sense. In the global north, we have workplace struggles of migrant workers who perform the bulk of care work in homes and hospitals, alongside a growing strike wave led by teachers and nurses. These are joined by community struggles for clean water and clean air, most often led by communities of color, exposing the deliberate, racialized poisoning of the environment by capital. In the global south, sustained women-led movements against extractive industries and massive dam building projects have shattered the developmentalist model as the singular roadmap to a prosperous future. These movements are integrating the defense of nature to the material well-being of human communities, reaffirming that the fate of the social world and the natural world are now co-constitutive. These insurgent care struggles build from each other, both politically through solidarities and conceptually, because social and ecological issues now chronically embed one another. Let's take the example, for instance, of protests led by indigenous Dumagat women against the Kaliawat Dam in the Philippines, which pose a threat to the Duterte regime, as well as to the entwined crimes of territorial dispossession, climate crisis, and gender violence. So Duterte, for those of you who know, is the Philippine capitalism's response in the Trumpist form. This multi-billion-dollar dam project to be built by Duterte, but with a loan from the Chinese government, so Chinese capital is involved in this too, will destabilize the ecosystems of the Sierra Madre forest, displacing hundreds of indigenous communities from their ancestral land and create conditions of extreme poverty and insecurity for women of these communities, conditions which are, of course, the breeding ground for gender and intimate violence. Kakai Tolentino, a member of the Dumagat tribe and national coordinator of the Bai Indigenous Women's Network, captured this connection perfectly when she pointed out, and I quote her, "We are impoverished and made landless because of the plunder of our ancestral lands. These are the biggest form of violence against indigenous women that should be put to an end." So gender violence is much wider than just on our bodies. Just as capitalist predation on land and life have cascading effects of harm on each other, these movements to recenter social reproductive care have the potential to reduce such harm also in cascading ways. In identifying climate crisis as a threat multiplier, we need to enshrine this movement understanding that climate change can only be confronted through social change, and it therefore has the potential of inciting movements rather than containing. We have to incite movements rather than contain movements. Capitalism, we know as a system, is future blind. It can and will sabotage even its own conditions of possibility in its drive for accumulation. The constant push to increase productivity is inextricably linked to this constant sense of accelerated time, and the use of fossil fuels drive up this perpetual speed up. Now, climate change has set a limit on how much longer this kind of production is possible. The system and the planet with it is experiencing time in a radically transformed ways. As one climate science theorist, Andreas Malm, put it, time is pouring down from the skies for us. If capitalist production is concerned only with a constant flattened present time of profit, social reproduction and feminist struggles as theory and practice direct attention to the future, to the ongoing reproduction of life of the species and the social world we create in and from the natural world. The continued reproduction of capitalism is now threatening the reproduction of actual life. In practice, our politics for social reproduction must be able to demonstrate that any just transition that we're talking about is capable of creating sustainable habitats where working class lives can flourish. Capitalism has stunted our imagination about the possibilities of public goods, conjuring up visions of housing projects in ruins, of crumbling subway systems infested with rats, but we can combine our own visions of a beautifully planned housing projects in walkable, democratically planned multiracial communities with any kind of job creation that we're talking about. We can fight for public parks, for music and theater programs. According to primacy, if we give primacy to a politics of life-making, we know it will conflict with the imperatives of profit-making. The reordering of social reproduction in this manner will require reducing working hours. It will require dismantling the military and carceral functions of the state in favor of social provisioning ones. So we must understand that any move to center this kind of social reproduction politics must center robust working class organizing in unions, in communities, and on our streets. So we must reject any analytical separation between workplace and non-workplace struggles. All struggles of the exploited and the oppressed, whether within or outside of workplaces, are animated by the politics and ethics of insurgent care. Workers demand better wages and benefits to better care for their own lives and those that they love. Communities struggle against the violence of the state, the killing by police of their children, or against mining companies in order to bring safety and care to their people. A politics informed by a narrow separation between workplace and non-workplace struggles is dangerous for our climate unstable times. Such a set of politics, for instance, will fail to mobilize labor unions in defense of climate migrants from the global south to the north, where compassion will be needed, only competition will be perceived. Struggles that confront climate change, struggles that confront racial violence, struggles that confront sexism sometimes have the greatest potential for fusing struggles against production, labor struggles, with the struggles against the effects of such production, which is movements for clean air or racial justice. The recent wave of feminist strikes, teacher strike, Palestinian liberation, and children's strikes and Black Lives Matter are the most remarkable examples of such fusion. We are only now witnessing the beginnings of what might become a global revolt against austerity. But our labor movements must be politicized beyond its trade union expression. The class as a whole, our wages and pensions, as well as our homes and playgrounds, must be defended against the ravages of capitalism. For this to happen, there needs to develop and spread what Rosa Luxemburg has called a class feeling, which allowed Russian workers in 1905 to see every partial question of even a small group of workers as a general question, as a class affair, which in turn provoked them to react to its influence as a unity. Every time there is a case of police violence, we all rise up together. Every time they bomb Gaza, we rise up together. This is yet to be. As a left, we sense it's coming. As revolutionary feminists, we must ensure its success. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tithi. I'll just remind folks about our commitment to snaps for participation or for appreciation. We do have some time for questions, so I'm happy to open up the floor. Folks, questions, comments? Yeah, one over here.
Last year, when the teacher strike started, I went to West Virginia, where the strike. By the way, I want all comrades to know this, right? I mean, we all say that West Virginia led off the strike wave, right? We say that, and we should absolutely honor that sentiment. But let me just say, this current strike wave, the first time since the Chicago teachers closed down schools in 2012, the first time school districts went on strike was not West Virginia. It was the 3 school districts on March 8th of 2017 during the International Women's Strike. And these school teachers went on strike on March 8th in right-to-work states without a union. They just called in sick, okay? So yes, we should say that West Virginia kicked off a strike wave, but we should not forget this enormous risk these teachers took on March 8th of 2017 to close down 3 school districts in right-to-work states. But to go back to your question, so one of the discussions, so when I went to West Virginia, I asked all the teachers, do you think there is a reason why this is happening in a sector where 80% of people are women, right? Most of the militant strikers said to me, this has got nothing to do with the fact that I'm a woman, it is everything to do with the fact that I'm a teacher, okay? I don't see myself as a feminist. So this is an understanding, but if you ask them specifically on specific issues, you will see that they will say, is there sexism in your workplace? Yes. Is there sexual assault in your workplace? Yes. So you break down that idea and they will say yes to all of those things. But the consciousness that this is a feminist strike or this is a feminist struggle was not there in the strike when you spoke it. But I think that is changing, and this is changing because of socialist feminist working groups that exist now. The DSA is a significant force, and these conversations are beginning. The tremendous influence. We're looking at women going on strike in their millions in various countries. So I think that conversation is changing within the labor movement, but it's nowhere where we want it to be in order for that thing to become a spontaneous organizing. And let us not forget that most labor unions are still dominated by male labor leaders who not only will not want to think about feminism, they don't even want to think about strikes. Every single one of these strikes have been done by these unruly women who basically gone against their labor leaders, right? So these are not men who are going to be open to feminism for the 99%. So I think that is a very crucial question, and I think these are the kind of venues that we should be organizing and talking about what are the next steps for building feminism for the 99%, a militant class struggle feminism in this country.
Other questions? There's one at the back.
I just wanted to say that there is international women's strike organizing here in Philadelphia. And on March 8th, we got together the issue of the family separation, like child welfare and after incarceration, and others. We only a workshop on that. So if anybody wants to reach out to help organize for next year,
Hi, I'm Tatiana from New York City DSA and also Left Voice. And so thank you for that. I have a lot of notes and a lot to think about, but I want to ask you a question. So I guess I was thinking a lot about, obviously like Hillary Clinton, Sheryl Sandberg, that kind of sort of lean-in feminism is obviously not feminism at all. A feminism that is bombing folks in the Middle East is not feminism at all, and it's certainly not a feminism for us. I feel like we're seeing a new sort of iteration that's very different and a little bit tricky to deal with, right? We're seeing all of these new women being elected to Congress, right? And the headlines were women elected to Congress, like as if representation in itself was the sort of end goal. And there's a lot of contradictions with these women. If we even take like AOC, right? Like a vote for her among folks is like super left, right? She says she's a socialist. She's quite left, the Green New Deal, things like that, things that we would support. But then on the other hand, here, like for the New York City DSA, we did a lot of stuff around, for example, the migrant caravan, or we're doing stuff around organizing sex workers. And then we have folks who are sort of iffy on those things, right? Or for example, we organize against the coup in Venezuela, and then AOC tweets like, yay humanitarian aid, and you're like, oh no. And so how, like, if we organize movements and then these elected officials vote, they seem more left, vote against our movements, right? What do we do with that? And how do you see the articulation between movement and electoral politics, especially when these elected officials, even if they're quite left, aren't really accountable to us and often vote in ways that I think a lot of the folks in this room don't agree with.
That was really stressful. Why was that stressful? That's a brilliant question. We ought to be discussing strategy here and right now. So that's absolutely a brilliant question. Okay, so there is no easy answer to your question. Obviously, if I had it, we would be doing it and organizing Petrograd Soviet. So, but my smallish answer to your question is, I think it's key to what you said at the very last, right? Which is, what does accountability look like? And I think accountability is almost impossible within the structures of the Democratic Party. We're not going to find accountability there, okay? So accountability, but I think we need to get away also, or not get away, maybe enlarge the question of accountability to think about some kind of revolutionary accountability. So these are elected officials. So voting is the least of revolutionary acts, as we all know, right? So it is, and this is why all the great Marxist thinkers of our times have always said, have always had a caveat when they write about elections, right? So, Lenin is a big advocate for elections in particular contexts, but he will constantly say it's still a bourgeois system that we're doing it. So there's always caveats. So it's a tricky proposition. The thing to remember about elections is we are, in the case of bourgeois elections, we're acting in their playground. This is not our playground. A strike, a picket line is our playground, and they have to come to us. An electoral arena is their playground, so it's a very tricky arena in which we operate, right? So, but we gotta operate in that arena if it is for raising up and advocating for our issues, and it gives us a megaphone into the world, okay? So if that is the case, then yes, we'll go and play in their arena, but we always have to be careful because the lines are circling it, right? So this is the question of where accountability is important. Can we seek accountability within those bourgeois structures, or should we seek accountability outside of the bourgeois structures? I'm all for seeking accountability within the structures, saying, hey, AOC, we voted you from this community. This is our skin color. This is our life history. Honor it. I'm all for that. But in order to actually make someone accountable, we need to build those accountability institutions in the communities where she was elected from, right? So for instance, I know that her vote against border policy, etc., was not done by AOC's team, but it was done by migrant justice groups in the neighborhoods that she was elected from, that voted for her. In those neighborhoods, migrant justice workers organized and said, you cannot vote for this bill, okay? So that kind of accountability, I think, building those structures and infrastructures back. We've lost our infrastructures of protest. We need to build those back into our communities. But I also think accountability has to be much larger than that, right? So it is not just about holding AOC accountable, but we must hold the bourgeois system accountable for what it is doing, so that we cannot see, oh, we've elected AOC, now this is done. So what we want to do is never give up that idea that our playground is the strike, the picket line, the social movement, okay? So if we get to a place where a left organization is solely dependent on an insurgent electoral movement, then we are doomed, okay? We are doomed. Because our strength is the social movement, our strength is the community organizing, is our labor unions, okay? And this is why them capitulating, the labor union capitulating to the electoral movement, is actually a problem that we need to address. Again, I am not advocating that we do not participate in their arena, but we must always understand it is their arena, it is their world we're participating in, and we must keep our world solid so that we can participate in that world with that fallback plan. I don't know, Tatiana, if that answers your question, but that's sort of going to where I want to go.
We have time for one more really quick question. Yeah.
And it has such a long history of both betrayals, but also a history of fightbacks, right? So, I mean, I think we discussed this one time in a meeting in the morning where I was talking about reviving and reliving some of the history of the fightbacks of the past, okay? And one of the things that 40 years of neoliberalism has done is erased our own histories from us, okay? There are no longer structures and institutions that tell us the histories of black women organizing domestic workers in New York in the 1920s and 30s, okay? How many of us know the histories of Claudia Jones, Phoebe Phillis? We don't, because these histories are lost. Because the big organizations that existed in the 20s, the Communist Party, Stalinist organization, everything, I'm completely on with that. But the point is that these organizations were mass organizations that had these memories and had these archives of struggle of their members. And all those organizations have been gone. Even the labor unions used to have labor halls and labor songs that were sung, okay? We don't have any of that anymore. So there is, I want to answer the comrade's question by saying, we don't need to, for each of these betrayals by the bourgeoisie, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes we do, because some of the challenges, for instance, climate change, are new for our generation. So we do need to reinvent a wheel for that. But for some of these betrayals, there have been foremothers in our past and forefathers in our past who have fought these challenges and who have actually succeeded in whatever ways. And part of capitalism's beauty is in erasing that history so that we don't have access to those voices and struggles. So our left, if this left is going to not die out like the previous left, then one of the vital projects should be the project of recovery, okay? That recovery of histories of our own past struggles, of working class communities, of communities of color, of international struggles everywhere. We want to recover so that we can fight back on the basis of those memories and histories.
I want to thank Tithi for a wonderful talk that I think we'll continue to be thinking about and talking about and returning to throughout the rest of the Convergence. So please join me in thanking her.